Well, good afternoon and welcome to our annual lecture series, Remembering Lee. We're so glad to have each of you here on the 146th anniversary of Lee's death to remember the contributions of the 11th president of Washington College and to learn more about the challenges he faced as president and the distinctive gifts he brought to bear on those challenges. My name is Lucy Wilkins, and I'm the Director of University Collections and Lee Chapel and Museum. One of the privileges of this position is to be able to tell the story of the remarkable contributions that both George Washington and Robert E. Lee made to higher education through this university. If you're unfamiliar with this story, I encourage you to take time for one of our tours and to digest the contents of our museum, which was so beautifully curated by Patricia Hobbs. I'd like to recognize the representatives of the United Daughters of the Confederacy who are here in attendance today. The UDC has a long history of support for the chapel, and we are happy to have such a good representation from the Virginia Division. Thank you, ladies. Our speaker today is one of our own, Dr. Holt Merchant, Professor of History Emeritus. Dr. Merchant taught at Washington and Lee for 43 years before retiring in 2013. He continued to teach part-time through this past academic year. During his tenure, he served as Martin and Brooks Stein Professor of American History, as Chair of the Department of History, and Marshal of the University. Dr. Merchant is also an alumnus. He received his BA in History from W&L in 1961. After serving 6 years in the U.S. Army, where he reached the rank of captain, he returned to his first love and earned his PhD in History from the University of Virginia in 1976. Dr. Merchant is married, and Becky Merchant is here with us today. They have 2 grown sons. He roots loudly for the Atlanta Braves and the Washington Redskins, and he officiates college cross country and track, and until recently, high school and college soccer. He lectures widely to general audiences, most often on George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and the Civil War. The University of South Carolina Press published his biography, South Carolina Fire Eater, Lawrence Kite, in the summer of 2014. When I was in school, we were not taught very much detail about the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War. I'm looking forward to hearing, as I'm sure you are, a seasoned professor such as Dr. Merchant on the topic of this turbulent period and how it affected Lexington, Lee, and the university. Dr. Merchant will come now and speak to us on Under a Cloud, Robert E. Lee Meets the Challenges of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1870. Dr. Merchant.
I'll begin with a note that I hadn't planned on. The seasons have been so appallingly awful for the Braves. Much as I love them, I'm rooting for the Cubs right now. Well, thank you for coming. A few of you understand just how hard it is to speak from this podium. I suspect that if you haven't spoken from this podium, you don't know how difficult it is. For one thing, you're a long way away. I spent 46 years in classrooms where I was normally only a few feet away from I suppose there were an audience. It's easy to make eye contact with students if they're not playing with their computers. It's easy to make contact from so close, and you're a long way away. And then there's the audience. And among the audience, I include the 2 men behind me. It's truly intimidating to speak with a colonel, soon to be general, ultimately to be president, looking over my right shoulder, and another general, soon to be president, looking over my left shoulder. It's intimidating to have Washington and Lee as part of the audience. I'm also intimidated by the men who have spoken on this occasion before me. Jubal Early, Charles Francis Adams, not to mention more recent scholars like Bud Robertson and Gary Gallagher. And you too are part of the problem. You've heard all the stories. I and historians and others have told the Lee story so often and in this very setting that they are familiar, I assume, to all of you. What could there possibly be left to talk about? Is there anything at all to talk about that I haven't talked about before? I can't talk about his youth. I've talked about his mother and his father and his education. You already know that Light Horse Harry was a war hero, but also a man who was a bankrupt. I've said on other occasions that he dreamed great dreams that turned to nightmares. He invested in land that lost value. He tried to build a canal around the falls of the James River, and there wasn't enough money and there wasn't enough technology, and he failed. He failed so spectacularly that he went to debtor's prison twice. And he was a Federalist. All of the Lees were either Federalists or later Whigs. Light Horse Harry was so much of a Federalist that he went to Baltimore at the beginning of the War of 1812 to defend a newspaper editor. And for his trouble, he was very nearly killed. And you know about his mother, Anne Hill Carter. The family was forced to leave Stratford when Lee was only 3 years old, though it was his birthplace. Stratford was inherited by a man unfortunately known, accurately known as Black Horse Harry Lee. When Lee was 3 years old, and Black Horse Harry, it wasn't his name yet. Some of you may know that he attended Washington College for a year and compiled a very, very bad record. Lee's mother's great problem was her health. So bad that Lee took over running the household in Alexandria long before he was ready. He was extremely well educated for his time and place. He went to Eastern View, a plantation owned by Elizabeth Carter Randolph, an aunt, where he was tutored. He attended an academy, which his mother paid for, even though she could barely put food on the table. And when it was clear that he was going to the military academy, she hired tutors to prepare him for college. And of course, you know that he attended the military academy at West Point. You may not know that his mother solicited letters of recommendation from a half dozen senators and congressmen, most of them related to the Lees. He was, of course, extremely successful there, as he was in his early career. His accomplishments at West Point qualified him for a position in the engineers. He worked on forts Pulaski and Hamilton and Monroe and Carroll, and I won't bother you with them. He took part in a border survey, which I rather like, if only because it's the one time that Douglas Freeman cheated in his wonderful 4-volume biography. Lee was up on I see at least one of you knows the story. Lee was up on the border and invaded a lighthouse on the Canadian side and reported in a letter to one of his buddies that he had killed a damn Canadian snake. Freeman believed that the snake had been a Canadian lighthouse keeper and covered it up. The first edition of his biography skipped over the story completely, and the second edition put it in a tiny little footnote. Well, it really was a snake. Lee wasn't a murderer. He worked on the problems of the harbor in St. Louis. The harbor was silting up, and Lee, through an ingenious technological stunt, saved the harbor. He fought brilliantly in Mexico, so brilliantly that Winfield Scott declared him the finest field officer he was familiar with. He was a superintendent at the military academy, where he experienced quiet times, and he commanded the 2nd Cavalry in Texas, where times were not quiet at all, less successful. He chased bandits and Indians all over Texas and caught nearly none of them. And then finally, his pre-war career ended with the capture of John Brown. And I've talked about all of that before, and his marriage and his family, and I don't dare talk about his marriage and his family because the lady who knows a great deal more than I do is sitting out there in the audience. And I really can't talk about the Civil War either, if only because you know a great deal about that. He was a reluctant secessionist, or so he tells us. He was a reluctant defender of slavery, although that's what he tells us. We historians are a naturally suspicious group. We are taught in graduate school to trust nothing and suspect everything. Lee said, of course, that he was prepared to sacrifice everything except honor to hold the Union together. And I believe him. Lee said that he was opposed to slavery. Now, you know, of course, that he owned slaves. We don't know how many, 4. We also know that Lee administered his father-in-law's estate that included at least 100 slaves. But Lee's attitude toward governments was what? Pre-modern. He believed that his loyalty to his family came first, and his loyalty to his state came second, and his loyalty to the nation came a distant third. And so when Virginia seceded, he went with her. You know, too, that he took command of the Army of Virginia, not Northern Virginia yet, Virginia, that he took part in a failed campaign in Western Virginia, the effort to save what became West Virginia. It really wasn't his fault. He had no command responsibility. He created the defenses of the Atlantic coast. He served for a time as a frustrated presidential advisor. And then the great turning point in the Civil War, when that piece of shrapnel hit Joe Johnson in the shoulder, and suddenly Lee was in command of what he named the Army of Northern Virginia. and experienced a number of spectacular successes. Second Manassas, of course, and Fredericksburg, of course, and Chancellorsville, and also failures like Sharpsburg and Gettysburg. And then there were the campaigns, I don't know what to call them. They weren't successes, but they weren't failures either. The 7 days, where his battle plan was absolutely brilliant, but much too complicated for his Green Army. The Overland Campaign, when I think he was at his very best, fighting with too few men and too little food and, well, too little of almost everything except guts. The Wilderness and Spotsylvania and North Anna and Cold Harbor. Not successes, really, but not failures either. And then Petersburg, when he held out for much longer, I suspect, than anybody else. And then the retreat to Appomattox and surrender. So I'm not going to talk about any of that because you already know it. And I'm not going to talk about the post-war years either, if only, well, perhaps you don't know them quite as well, but I've talked about them so often in the past. His return to Richmond for a short time, his discovery that he could not possibly get any rest from the hordes who were coming to, well, just touching. The summer he spent at Derwent out in Fluvanna County, the invitation from Washington College, and the most wonderful decision to come to Washington College, where he recruited students and disciplines students. One of the faculty members who was here with Lee called the students incurably vicious. And perhaps they were. So many of them had been in the Army for so long, it must have been very difficult for them to settle down to a life of books. He also attracted a distinguished faculty. And although I really don't think it was Lee himself who reformed the curriculum, the curriculum would not have been reformed if Lee had not approved, and of course it was. And he rebuilt the college, which had gone to rack and ruin during the war, and built this chapel, which I think he would have been horrified to find us calling it Lee Chapel, but I'm glad we do. And he built the president's home. And he provided a great deal of excellent advice, not just to his students, but to Southerners generally. Let the past be but the past. Go home, work your farms, marry your sweethearts, make babies, rebuild the South. Well, I've said nothing so far about Lee and political Reconstruction, and that's the place where I think I might be able to tell you some things you probably don't know unless you've read Volume 4 of Freeman very, very carefully. What I'm going to talk about is his encounter with the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which was really an extension of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which was extremely controversial in the North, of course, if only because it was very radical and because it gave Democratic generals, that is, generals who were Democrats, a very hard time. Of course, some of them deserved it. George McClellan in particular. But the story begins on the 18th of December, 1865, when the Congress created this Joint Committee on Reconstruction. On the 23rd of January, 1866, the committee, which was rightly concerned about the condition of the southern states, which was rightly concerned about the willingness of the citizens of those states to accept the outcome of the war, rightly concerned about the loyalty of white Southerners to the Union, rightly concerned about the treatment of the freedmen in the South, began taking testimony from the men who supposedly knew the most about the situation in the South. Union officers serving in the South or who had served in the South, Southern Unionists, Northerners, civilians who resided in the South. And as you might expect, Lee was occasionally mentioned in their testimony. Judge John C. Underwood, who was functioning essentially as a governor of Virginia, not technically, but Underwood speculated that 11 out of any 12 members of any jury in the state would agree, and now I'm quoting Underwood, Lee is almost the equal of Washington and the noblest man in the state. This at a time when an awful lot of Northerners wouldn't have agreed. John Monner Botts, who came from down the valley just a little way in Stanton, described plans of Virginians to elect Lee governor. I think Lee would have been horrified by that idea, and of course it never happened. Colonel Orlando Brown, who I'd never heard of until I began looking into this episode. Brown was the assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau in Virginia. Brown, I know of no man who has more fully the hearts of the people than he has the hearts of Virginians. And after this, of course, the committee called Lee to testify. On the 16th of February, 1866, Lee took the train, still from Stanton, the railroad hadn't gotten to Lexington yet, took the train to Washington, where he stayed in the Metropolitan Hotel and was simply swamped by friends and well-wishers. There were so many people who wanted to see Lee at his hotel that a number of his friends formed a committee to fend them off. Well, they couldn't fend them all off, including one old Confederate who somehow got through the screen and asked Lee, "Why did you lose at Gettysburg?" Well, Lee might have said something on the order of, "I thought the Federals had something to do with that." But he didn't get to answer because his protectors hustled the old man out of the room. The next day, the 17th of February, Lee testified before two members, a subcommittee really of the full committee on Reconstruction, a man named Jacob Howard from Michigan and a man named Henry Blow from Missouri, whose family was from Virginia. More about him in just a minute. The committee had 13 members, and an easy majority of the members were talented, experienced, really formidable men. Charles Sumner had desperately wanted to be a member of that committee, but he was so radical, even the radical Congress refused to appoint him. A radical it did appoint was Thaddeus Stevens, and if you saw that wonderful movie Lincoln, Stevens played a major role. Stevens was almost as radical as Sumner and was even more controversial. In 1930, a neo-Confederate historian, a man named John Fort Milton, called Stevens, I'm quoting, a club-footed, cadaverous, malignant, debauched old man. And there's a considerable amount of truth in it. He might also have said that he wore a wig and the wig was never on straight. There were rumors before the war in Pennsylvania that he had had an affair with his mulatto housekeeper, that she became pregnant, he killed her and stuffed her down a well. And the rumors were persistent enough that authorities had to investigate, and they found nothing in the well except water. George Boutwell, another member of the committee from Massachusetts, and a radical. He was one of the leaders of the effort to remove Andrew Jackson from the presidency. Andrew Johnson from the presidency. A modern historian ranked Boutwell with Benjamin Franklin Butler, Beast Butler, Spoons Butler, who is very well known, and another man who's really not well known, James Ashley of Ohio, as I'm quoting, the most baleful trio of buzzards ever to perch in the house, which is true. Ashley was a conspiracy nut. And although Andrew Johnson deserved the harassment he was getting, not this much. So there were some very strange characters on this committee, but there were also a number of thoroughly admirable men. One of them was Justin Smith Morrill from Vermont. During the war, he sponsored legislation to reform the tariff, which desperately needed it. Legislation that imposed the first internal revenue tax on the country and granted public land to states to promote higher education. And one of the results is about 90 miles up into the mountains from here, now Virginia Tech. There were two especially admirable senators sitting on this committee, William Pitt Fessenden of Maine and James Grimes of Iowa. They were among the most influential members of the Senate, and when the time came, they cast two of the votes that prevented the removal of Andrew Johnson from the presidency, which could have set a very unfortunate precedent. But they weren't all of that caliber. John Bingham of Ohio was a member of the committee that prosecuted Johnson in the Senate. Roscoe Conkling, surely one of the most corrupt men who ever sat in the in the Congress, in the Senate. Reverend E. Johnson from Maryland, the only Democrat who voted in favor of the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and the only Democrat who condemned Johnson's veto of that legislation. But, lest I lose the train of my remarks, whatever their weaknesses, whatever its weaknesses, the Reconstruction Act did at least provide the southern states with a path back into the Union, however difficult. But back to the members of the committee, whatever their strengths or weaknesses, however attractive or unattractive they may have been in their personalities, their motivations, their tactics, all of these men, the ones that I've mentioned, and some of the members I have not mentioned, had the ability to give Lee a very uncomfortable few hours when he appeared before the committee. But Lee was extremely fortunate. None of them sat on the subcommittee that questioned him. The two men who did, I've already mentioned them, Jacob Howard, a radical Republican from Michigan, and Henry Blow, a somewhat more moderate Republican from Missouri, men whose careers in the Congress were short and undistinguished. Howard served in the House for one term, 1841 to 1843, and the Senate for slightly more, well, he served in parts of two terms, 1862 to 1871. Blow, at least to me, is more interesting, not because he served two terms in the House of Representatives between 1863 and 1867, but because Blow's family owned Dred Scott. And Blow himself helped to raise money to support Scott's legal efforts to win his freedom, which were, of course, unsuccessful, but he was ultimately bought out of slavery. Now, Lee didn't want to testify. He was determined to say as little as he could, to say no more than he absolutely had to, but he was also determined not to compromise his honesty, his integrity. In the beginning of his testimony, Lee explained that he was living, and this is his phrase, very retired. Well, he wasn't retired in the sense that he was president of Washington College, but in truth, Lexington, before the construction of the railroad, was not much easier to get to than an oasis in the middle of the Arabian desert today. We really were cut off from just about everything. And so Lee testified that he saw very few politicians. He didn't like politicians, and he knew very little about popular opinions in the South, whether it was Reconstruction or taxes or the future of the freedmen or anything else. Howard began asking questions about the loyalty of Southerners to the federal government. His questions were hypothetical, and that meant that Lee was going to have very little trouble fending them off. But I'll give you a few examples. Senator Howard, in the event of war between the United States and any foreign power, such as England or France, if there should be held out to the secession portion of the people of Virginia or other recently rebel states a fair prospect of gaining their independence and shaking off the government of the U.S., is it or is it not your opinion that they would avail themselves of the opportunity? Lee, I cannot speak with any certainty on that point. I do not know how far they might be actuated by their feelings. I have nothing whatever to base an opinion upon. So far as I know, they can contemplate nothing of the kind. The reference here, which may be a little bit obscure, the French had sided with the Confederacy during the war, and the British had provided the Confederacy with weapons, and the United States was seeking money as a means to get back at them, and there was some possibility of war, but not really. But Howard was determined. He pushed on. Do you not frequently hear in your intercourse with secessionists, these words, secessionists and rebels, clearly made Lee angry, but he kept his temper. It was well known during the war in the Army that when Lee was displeased with you, he called you into his tent and he told you about it calmly, but the next man into the tent was in real trouble. Lee's reply, I cannot say I have heard it. On the contrary, I have heard people express the hope that the country may not be led into war. Howard should have given this one up, but he didn't. Howard should have realized that he wasn't going to gain anything by this line of questioning, but he wasn't skilled enough to find another one. Howard, in such an event, do you not think that many of that class of persons whom I have called secessionists would join the common enemy? Lee, he's simply not going to be provoked, and he's not going to give the man an opinion. It is possible. It depends upon the feelings of the individual. Howard, what in such an event might be your own choice? Now, this is an amazing question to put to a man who is exhausted, impoverished, suffering from a bad heart, probably demoralized, wanted nothing more than to be left in peace, to run his college and provide for his family, and Howard wants to know if he wants to go back to war. Lee, I have no disposition now to do it, and I never have had. Howard, you cannot foresee that such would be your inclination in such an event? Lee, no. I can only judge by the past. I do not know what circumstances may produce. I cannot foresee events. So far as I know, the feeling of the people of Virginia, they want peace. And then Howard took a slightly different approach to essentially the same question. Did you take any oath of fidelity or allegiance to the Confederate government? Now, what he was really asking was, did you swear allegiance to the United States when you became a member of the Union Army, and then swear allegiance to the Confederacy? Or if you like, did you break your oath? Are you a traitor? Lee, again, holding his temper, I do not recollect having done so, but it is possible that when I was commissioned, I did. I do not recollect whether it was required. If it was required, I took it. Or if it had been required, I would have taken it. But I do not recollect whether it was or not. Now, I kind of wonder if Lee could forget taking an oath to the Confederacy, but let's take his word for that. And now it was Henry Blow's turn, and he asked a series of questions about Johnson's Reconstruction policy. And here it's necessary to know that radicals in the North were becoming increasingly unhappy with Johnson's Reconstruction policy because they believed it was too lenient. It threatened to, I guess threaten's the right word, it promised to readmit Southern states to the Union, if in fact they had ever left the Union, too easily. Blow, you do not feel down there that while you accept the results of the war that we are as generous as we ought to be under the circumstances? Lee, they, Southerners, think that the North can afford to be generous. Blow, this is the feeling down there? Lee, yes, and they think it is the best policy. Those who reflect upon the subject, and he means the educated and the intelligent, those who reflect upon the subject and are able to judge, do believe that the North should be lenient and generous. Blow, I understand it to be your opinion that generosity and liberality toward the entire South would be the surest means of regaining their good opinion. Lee, yes, and the speediest. Well, by this time, Howard must have grown tired of Blow's practical approach, and he returned to the hypothetical. Would Southerners be willing to convict Jefferson Davis of the crimes he committed during the war? Now, you can imagine how Lee reacted to that. Jefferson Davis didn't commit any crimes during the war. Howard, they do not Southerners. They do not generally suppose that that is, Davis's actions, the South's actions during the war, was treason against the United States, do they? Lee, I do not think that they so considered it. Howard, in what light would they consider it? What would be their excuse or justification? How would they escape in their own mind? And at this point, I get the feeling from the transcript that Lee interrupted. As to the feelings they would have, so far as I know, they look upon the action of the state in withdrawing itself from the government of the United States as carrying individuals of the state along with it, that the state was responsible for the act, not the individual. Now, I suspect that this is an argument and a defense that was possible at the time. It would not be possible now in lieu of World War II and the Nuremberg trials, but I'll pass on all of that. Howard, and that the ordinance of secession, so-called, or those acts of the states which recognize the condition of war between the state and the general government, stood as their justification for their bearing arms against the government of the United States. In other words, why shouldn't the Union treat all white Southerners as traitors and criminals? Lee, I think they considered the act of the state as legitimate, that they were merely using the reserved right, and he didn't spell it out, of course, because they all knew the right of rebellion against a tyranny was what he meant, which it had a right to do. Howard, state, if you please, what your own personal views on that question were. Lee, that was my view, that the act of Virginia in withdrawing herself from the United States carried me along as a citizen of Virginia, and that her laws and her acts were binding on me. Again, this is an argument that would not carry a lot of water today, but carried a great deal of water then. State rights were, of course, far more popularly supported then than they are even now. Lee clearly put his loyalty to his state ahead of his loyalty to the Union, to the nation. And like most military officers now as well as then, he put a very high priority on obeying orders. And this set Howard back, if only because he understood that the concept of state rights was still popular in the North. There was a long pause, and then Howard said, I've been told that you have remarked to some friends that you were wheedled or cheated into that course by politicians. Now again, you can just imagine Lee's anger at being accused of having been befuddled by politicians, fooled, tricked into supporting the Confederacy. Lee, I do not recollect making any such remark. I do not think I ever made it. I may have, and I may have believed that position of the two sections which they held to each other was brought about by the politicians of the country, that the great masses of the people, if they understood the real question, would have avoided it. But not that I had been individually wheedled by politicians. Lee's saying he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was taking responsibility for it. Next, Blow asked a series of questions about the attitudes of the white South toward the freedmen. And here, Lee's answers make me acutely uncomfortable. But in analyzing his answers, I try to remember that Lee was not a 21st century American. He had lived in a world in which slavery was common. He had owned slaves, not many, but he did. He had administered the estate of his father-in-law, which included slaves. He had said repeatedly that he opposed slavery. And so his answers reflected the views of the mid-19th century white South, a man who was, in its terms, enlightened, paternalistic, and Christian. Lee was an evangelical. He believed that when God was ready for slavery to end, God would end it. Blow had proposed legislation to extend the franchise to the freedmen and asked Lee's opinion. Lee: my own opinion is that at this time they cannot vote intelligently, and that giving them the right of suffrage would open the door to a great deal of demagoguery and lead to embarrassment in various ways. What the future may prove, how intelligent they may become, with what eyes they may look upon the interests of the state in which they may reside, I cannot say. Blow: do you think that Virginia would be better off if the colored population were to go to some other southern state? Lee: I think it would be better for Virginia if she could be rid of them. Blow: do you think that Virginia is absolutely injured and its future impaired by the presence of the black population there? Lee: I think it is. Blow: do you think that the natural resources of the state would attract qualified, meaning white, labor if it were made attractive by the absence of the colored race? Lee: I do. One final subject was left to the subcommittee. In the North, the treatment of captured Union soldiers confined in Confederate prison camps had provoked widespread anger, and radicals in the North had blamed Lee unfairly for their suffering. And so Howard asked Lee what he knew about what he called the cruelties practiced toward the Union prisoners at Libby Prison and Belle Isle. Libby Prison and Belle Isle because they were both in the James River, well, in Richmond and the James River in Lee's sector of command. Lee: I never knew that any cruelty was practiced, and I have no reason to believe that it was practiced. I had reason to believe that privations may have been experienced because provisions and shelter could not be provided for them. There's Lee using the subjective. I wish he hadn't, because the Confederates simply didn't have the provisions to provide. After all, they couldn't provide for their own men. Howard: were you not aware that those prisoners were dying from cold and starvation? Lee: I was not. And then he changed the subject a little bit. I made several efforts to exchange prisoners after the cartel was suspended. The cartel, of course, being the agreement between the two nations to exchange POWs. I do not know why it was suspended. Now, I suspect that he did know why it was suspended. It was suspended because the Confederacy refused to exchange black POWs. This line of questioning might have produced an explosion, but it didn't. It produced no more new revelations, and after 2 hours, the interrogation ended. Remarkably short when we remember the length of committee hearings that have been common for quite some time. So, I think Lee was fortunate. His interview could have lasted much, much longer. He was fortunate because the questions put to him could have been much more probing. Howard could have asked for more facts and fewer opinions. Howard and Blow could have been more demanding. They could have refused Lee to fend off questions. And for that matter, and if you consider the history of World War II immediately after the close of the fighting, they could have refused to honor the parole that Grant issued Lee at Appomattox and accused Lee of committing war crimes, which is essentially what they were doing during this interview. They could have confined him in federal prison. They had confined Jefferson Davis in Fortress Monroe. It's even it's conceivable that they could have executed it, but they didn't. They let him return to Lexington. They let him return to his family and his church and his college. And for all of those reasons, we should be profoundly grateful that they did.
Brief 5 minutes of questions. If you would like to come to the microphone and ask Holt some questions about this
I seem
talk.
to have taken up most of the question period for you.
That's all right.
I'm somewhat surprised that in this investigation that they conducted, that it did not come out from Lee that Virginia was one of 3 states that reserved the right to secede, and therefore what his state did was considered to be legal by them. If you can comment on that.
Perhaps he didn't know about that reservation. If he did or if he didn't, he clearly believed that not just Virginia, not just the 3 states, but all of the states had that right.
Professor Merchant, to what extent did Lee's limited comments on political reconstruction contribute to the creation of the sort of post-war myth about his life?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I have an interesting answer for you. If I were looking for an initial source for the belief, it would be Jubal Early. Jubal Early, who spoke from this very spot, although presumably not behind this very podium. Jubal Early, who spoke here in, I believe it was 1871, who was heavily, if not exclusively, responsible for the myth of the Confederacy and the lost cause, and the idea that the South was not defending slavery, which of course it was, but really was defending state rights, was objecting to the tariff. Let me put that one to bed quickly before anybody asks. The tariff had been reduced twice since nullification, and was restored to protective levels only after the southern states left the Union. If I were looking for approximate cause of the myth of the Confederacy and the lost cause and the unimportance of slavery, Jubal Early. Early was the founding father of the Confederate Association, whose title is escaping me at the moment, but many of you will know, who popularized the post-Civil War neo-Confederate take on Confederate history.
Thanks, sir.
Lou, excellent presentation, by the way. I wanted to ask you, because you voiced some discomfort with Lee's comments regarding race. And I know you don't have a lot of time, but could you speak a little bit more about that, especially in regards to actions that he took after the war? I know it's been much in debate and dispute, and these days here it's a very sensitive subject. But
I can say a lot of words in 30 seconds.
Yes, I'm sorry. Big subject. But maybe just some brief comments if you could. Thank you.
Lee's behavior after the war was extremely careful. He was determined not to say anything that would give the Radical North an excuse for making Reconstruction relations between the North and South, relations between black and white, any more difficult than they already were. I suspect, and maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, I suspect that you're referring to the story that Lee was either a member of the Ku Klux Klan or sympathized with the Ku Klux Klan. There is absolutely no evidence whatever to support that suspicion. And well, my image of Lee is that he was a paternalist. He believed that blacks were inferior to whites overall, but he also believed that whites, as Christians, had an obligation to treat the freedmen with sympathy, with compassion, with justice. Now, it would be easy for the participants in Reconstruction to battle over the definition of justice, but Lee wanted the best for all Southerners of whatever race.
This is a yes and no answer. Make it easy for you.
Richard, you know I can't answer a question yes or no.
Anyway, as you know, I'm big in the Indian Wars now. Have you ever read anything expressing Lee's policy against the Native Americans in the Civil War out west, or in the period that he lived after the Civil War? You ever find any?
I don't know of him saying anything about Native Americans. My friend, incidentally, to add a footnote here, my great friend Harvey Markowitz insists that the Indians call themselves Indians and think we're a little strange for calling them Native Americans, but never mind, that quibble aside. He was in Texas for about 2 years, and he did, I can't say he fought against the Indians because he was never able to catch up with any. He spent a good deal of his time on court-martial duty, but when he wasn't, when he was in the field, he was singularly unsuccessful. He chased Mexican bandits. At least he got them back across the Rio Grande. He chased Indians, and the Indians, I'm trying to remember if there were any exceptions. He may have captured a woman and 2 children. I should know because I spoke in Dallas some years ago about Lee and the 2nd Cav in Texas, and if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd have the exact number in my head about the Indians he captured, but he was not able to stop the fighting between settlers and Indians, and he wasn't able to make the Indians behave.
You know, I'm sure you know, such a strong policy that the Confederacy had against the Indians in the West. There's a complete annihilation. I just wondered if you you ever read anything where he got involved in that or made any comments?
No, although and I rather hope that my colleague for a very short time, Professor Myers, is sitting out there and can help. My impression is that there were Confederate Indians. There he is.
I'm afraid really that's all the time we have. I think you're going to have to get hold of Professor Myers and ask him those questions as well. So thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate it.